All right, guys. I don't know, like, should it be the next speaker, or if you have any other questions, any questions you can ask?
Any questions?
All right.
No questions? Oh, many questions. Okay. You have the microphone.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. It was really, really great and insightful. But, you know, some alarm bell went in my head as you presented. Webpack, with all its might, is one of the oldest ladies around. And it's probably as good as the next tool that will come. There's already probably TurboPack that is kind of like running behind it, etc. The question is specifically, like, how would you compare the model federation feature of Webpack, and what does it fix that like dynamic inputs do not fix? Kind of like try to put it in a sort of like Next.js type of application where you already got like the pages, and you already got Next.js kind of like building like the different packages, like doing a lot of the heavy load that Webpack would normally do. So what does it solve that dynamic inputs wouldn't?
So we can get two answers. So one answer can be from Sasha, but the next answer will be from the guy who built Model Federation.
All right. All right. I will provide the quick answer. So this Model Federation plugin is just override the default import behavior in Webpack, and then it's kind of enabled you to load another modulus at runtime, right? So we can build them independently and then load those modulus from another Webpack assembly from the CDN, from any host, right? And compared to Next.js, it's actually monolith, so you build it, right? And then you cannot build, I would say, it's actually monolith. You do the whole application, and you cannot do the same. You cannot, I would say, import some smaller parts of application from the different CDN buckets and so on. Yeah, so it's my small answer, but I guess creator of Model Federation will answer much better.
Okay, let's see.
All right, so dynamic importing inside of a monorepo versus federated imports. Similar concept, load chunks from somewhere. Main issue that I run into usually is, let's say, I use Next.js myself with federation. So the big challenge I run into is I have over 60 independent teams. So with that level of velocity and deployment, it becomes really tricky to say, update meganav. So either from a risk profiling perspective, I need to split up these applications. My financial part is separate from, say, my main commerce part. So if I want to update the navigation, that's like a 2-week process to roll it out through, say, 10 independent instances of Next. I can't keep it in a monorepo because of risk and some other things like that, so I need this distribution layer. What it ends up getting toward is some of our teams don't even know how to do the NPM package deployments because they've only worked with federation. They press merge and it shows up across the company in 15, 20 seconds. So it gives you a lot more scalability and flexibility beyond just like a single file system. But in general, it is dynamic imports between bundles. So similar kind of concept, but you don't have to have a single build pass that you have to wait for a big monolith to roll over. With TurboPack and stuff like that, they're looking at bigger, faster monolith, but not necessarily trying to tackle the distribution issue that comes with a monolith, no matter how quick it gets.
Thank you. A big clap. Okay. That was good. That was good. Okay, thank you so much. That's the beauty of having the guy who built the Module Federation in your meetup. Okay, thank you so much. Next speaker, we have Dima.
I will tell you when to start because we have the slide with your face on the screen. Okay.
He said to wait. They deploying something most likely, and I will check microphone. So like, I will try to speak into the microphone thing. If I will fail, remind me about that because I often do that. Both. While technical team is working on that stuff, so I will start with kind of don't waste the time because we are delayed on the start. So I believe there was a slide with my name somewhere. I can do it differently, you know, just like distributed model federation. They will get back to that. We're gonna speak about model federation and X and next stuff. I would love to touch a couple of bit of things about TurboPack, Turbo Repo. They are developed in pretty much appropriate way, and they're guaranteed to work only with Next.js. While in Nix, with Nix you can go any direction you like, and any set of frameworks whatsoever. You're gonna fix it?
Yeah, I will fix it. I think it's getting fixed.
Okay. So basically what I'm saying is NX give you much more flexibility in terms of what you can choose to work with. And Next.js overall is a Vercel company, part of the Vercel company. So whatever they do for Vercel. So if you are not a part of Vercel ecosystem, and there are big chances are that if you are trying to go to model federation, there should be a point where you're going to start. And that's not necessarily being an Next.js, right? So, but going with an X, you definitely know that whatever you choose for the front end, or you have already that a part of an X, or there are some kind of additional like open source plugins for Narwhal and X which do support. So for example, if you want to try RSPack, and I do highly recommend to try RSPack, there are Narwhal RSPack module, which is not a part yet of like core, all of the things, but it's already available out there. You can install it, has generators, it has a RSPack version. Currently folks working on doing like nightly builds to check that everything works properly together. And like in terms of the speed, like we had a joke that if he was doing like NX serve with RSPack, it will be like sub-second to run compared to Webpack because it's much faster. And on the other hand, there are like configuration with Webpack and RSPack almost the same. So that's a great thing to have. So we switch back to Zoom. Okay. Yeah. Just. Okay. So the entry part, I suppose, is pretty much done. This talk will be, I can skip some parts because there was already mentioned parts. And there will be one more talk later today related to model federation and version of the deployment. So I will like pay a little more or less time to that part, but that's still very critical. And I have not started with self-introduction because like I do believe that doesn't really matter if you don't have a context. We're not gonna speak about like small application. We had a great talk with you today that if you have a small applications, like using model federation doesn't really make sense for you because that's using like Tech only for the sake of Tech. It's not really great. Yes, we can hype, but it doesn't really make sense. But if you kind of work with the teams where like have 50, 200 developers and it's monorepo or something, you have like 500 commits per week, your PRs are just going ages to review and merge and all of that nice things to have. That's not great. That's then some that moment when you're like, or I'm quitting this company, or we should do that somehow better, right? That's the point where like, or one way or another. And when you're like another part, when your builds start to crumble, right? Because like on some company we had not so long ago, they have split even their monorepo into like, I suppose 7 parts. And total, like, but to run all of that, you have to build all of that, and it takes 3 hours. It's insane, right? So, like, would you work there? Definitely not. So, model federation milestones, worth to mention. I had the pleasure to work with model federation and Angular when it was not yet on release. It was related to SAP requests, and I was the person responsible to merge support of model federation into Angular CLI. So in order to do that, I have to compile Angular CLI and Angular on my machine and run from zip files with like zip files of Webpack. It's really interesting kind of thing, but it was working since like 2010, like June, and it's great because even like all of those crazy betas right? That was working like only in 4 months it was released. And I don't know when we have started to work together as partners. Like he's more like React side, I'm from Angular world, but I'm doing Next.js for money now. So for the last couple of years, nothing personal. So interesting part here that I was somehow lucky since that time to be a part of, as a consultancy and helping to develop how to integrate model federation into teams. I would say like teams, like products. Products is just a representation of our teams, right? Of our organizational structure, like Conway Law, hello, and all of that things. So I was a part of, I don't know, like 10, 20 already organizations and companies where I do not only consult, like, do that, that's great. No, I was there coding with folks in order to implement that. So, you know that person when somebody comes outside and starts to propose new great things, there are always a team who like, nah, that's kind of crap, like you're gonna fix it, right? So there will be presentations which will speak about micro and frontends, great, and all of that stuff, but we will speak about much more interesting stuff, which is like the bad, the good, the bad, the ugly, because you should understand the price you're gonna pay and most likely how you're gonna, right, fix it. I will have some assumptions, hopefully they're right for this audience, that you have seen micro frontends, you do on a previous presentation, right? You have heard of model federation, hope so too. Used NPM libraries, and I mean you used NPM libraries, not just installed them, but at least try to build one. Updated package.json, don't be smiling about updating package.json, I have people who know that's an issue. Heard of Phoenix and SDLC, which is software development lifecycle, which is important for you because the way how we speak about model federation always relates to our way of how we plan, develop, and then release. Like speaking about model federation out of the context of SDLC doesn't really make sense because that's the way how our team can work. And have seen Next.js advertisement because not everything they kind of promise is true, but there are still parts which actually works. It's used here as a sample of a framework. So if you'll replace here Next.js with something like Next, Angular, or CityJS for Quick or whatever, those are frameworks, right? Some part of here, like slides now, we can skip, but what this means for is that we say micro frontends and we say about like bright reasons to use, right? So if we say like large scale application, we do mean that it's unmaintainable crap, right? So when we say autonomy and ownership, we mean that we are tired of politics of other team that we are not able to do improvements to our application. Kinda, right? So we have to say like technology agnostic, and we can use React and Angular combined with model federation, different versions. Kinda can use, but we're not gonna do that because that's gonna be slow, right? Then we do like easier updates, whatever. What do we mean? Like when we say like we need to refactoring, bundle our versions, like we need to spend time to like we need 2 weeks to upgrade our application, which nobody gonna approve, right? But if you're able to do the same stuff in 1 hour, you will not even create a task for that, and you're gonna do that, and that's what you can achieve with micro frontends, right? With maintenance, we mean that we are able to update our code to some state where we are proud of it, at least some bit, right? Incremental development, it's pretty much multi-repo, and big teams is you can merge your PR in 1 week and not take a month to do that. So, model federation on top of micro frontends or close to it, right? So we say about content, code sharing. And under code sharing, we mean 2 huge parts of that. We mean containers, which actually the components which you write, and there are second part, your containers using some kind of libraries. I will pay a lot of attention to libraries here because superpower of model federation comes from shared libraries. Because there are one questionable thing of model federation, sorry Zach, it's performance. Because there are no proper tree shaking of model federation. You know, yeah. But yes, we're working on reverse tree shaking, but a separate story. But At this moment, Model Federation doesn't have a tree shaking. So if you want to have really good performance, you're going to do two things. Share as much as you can libraries between containers. Secondly, try to deploy it to edge. But going forward, independent deployments. Very important here is independent deployments. Like difference between monolith and distributed monolith, right? There are no different, like it's amount of repositories, but you have to, you have many repos, but you have to deploy them at once. Those not are micro front ends, those are not microservices. This is distributed monolith. But if you can independently deploy your kind of mini application and it will be consumed properly, then you're going into micro frontends. Independence here is a factor. Separation of concepts, concerns, whatsoever. When we say that, we mean that we are able to properly split our code and organize it into a predictable fashion. So if you have many similar applications, you open any application from those like micro frontends, and you know where to look for services or look for, I don't know, pages, whatsoever. So if we speak about React, that could be very surprisingly places where you're going to see them. But if you speak about things like Angular, Next.js, CRA, NX, whatsoever, you do understand that they have code organization, and you open that repository, and you know where you're going to find that stuff, right? Which is great. Then goes micro frontends with Model Federation, which is best friends forever, obviously, and incremental adoption, which is, I call enterprise jailbreak, right? So you have a monolith, and you need to somehow start to bring Model Federation, and because it's easy to start, and we'll get back there later, it's really enterprise jailbreak, because just to add Model Federation support to your monolith, especially if it's Webpack, it's not that a big of a deal, and then you can start to inject something outside. And that allows you to, especially for enterprise, we're gonna get there, that when like enterprise buys another company, usually what they do is they spend 2-3 years of money, they buy something for $1 million, then they spend several years to actually adapt that to their tech stack, and then only then they're able to use that, right? But with Model Federation, what they usually do, they easily inject, like they have the monolith, they add Model Federation support, they buy something, they took one page, one small part, don't rewrite all of the application. Like in 2 months, they have their first page, they're able to inject from what they have bought. So this is called return of investment, and it creates like a huge leap, right? From 3 years, you go into 2 months in order to get first return of investment, which is great. Oh. And of course, NX, I'm gonna skip the most part of it, but I wanna to pay attention to several things. When we speak about huge teams, and those teams are split into smaller ones, there are one word which is kind of like, okay, 2 words, second one I can pronounce, but scalability, right? So if you have an approach, you have a Model Federation, and you want to scale that approach, how are you gonna do that? Write a documentation. You can write a documentation, but you cannot force people to read it. That's the tricky part. So what are you gonna do, especially with NX? You're not gonna write the documentation. I don't do. I cannot. I'm writing for computers. I cannot write for humans. That's just not works for me. There are a couple of things which you can do to make the way how you work actually scale. Generators and executors. Because generators basically it's a template of some folder of the component of the Model Federation configuration whatsoever, and executors, it's how it's going to be executed. Like in PM Yarn whatsoever, it's also executors, but there are more complex stuff. When you have to provide configuration for development or production or something special, like for example, if you have an application and you have Webpack build, right? That's executor Narwhal Webpack. Then you change executor to Narwhal RSPack, and it will be executed via RSPack. And nobody inside of the application or the team not going to know that it's actually now RSPack, only because it's faster. Because executors are something else in terms of configuration, and it's a great deal. On top of that goes like a separate part about the migration itself, which like was touched a bit, but should be touched even more. Because like when you need to share your approach with everybody, that's something which is going to win you, because you do that pretty much once, and then people do like one command. And I do recommend you to make that part of a command as a part of your dependabot script. So when dependabot look that you have a package update, make it run and migrate that package. And then you magically happen not only package JSON change, but you actually changed your code if you did migration in AST, which is kind of insane. Then you have a PR, which has package JSON change, it has code change, and it runs all of your tests. And you're more confident to merge that, which is kind of really great thing to share parts. And we will skip most of the slides because it was in previous presentation, but okay, whatever. Next.js, in the context of micro frontends, not model federation itself. We spoke about importance of several things, right? Consistent dev environment. You go into any your micro frontend or model federation container, you know which commands to run, right? Because that is knowledge sharing. It's not even knowledge sharing, it's a simplifying thing. You know that you go into any your microfront, you do install, you do start, you know there will be Nix, it's gonna run, right? Any framework comes with conventions. That's a funny story about React and Next.js, right? Everybody loves React because it's not opinionated. But 16 versions after, they so tired of this freedom of choose and working libraries, like to combine all of that crap to make it work, that like when Next.js came, like, okay, we have a set of libraries which actually works together properly, like, but we opinionated, there are like a folder structure, like we rewrote loadable, like called that Next Dynamic. We rewrote some else from ecosystem, and it's now like TurboPack, Turbo, whatever, but it actually works all together. So framework with opinions, it's actually somewhere good, right? And when I said like Next.js framework, opinion, conventions, Angular, same thing, Quick City, same thing. They have a conventions, which is great. Be careful though, like some conventions which work for Next.js, not gonna work for model federation. Code organization is pretty much a folder structure where you know where the things are. So you have a standard already somehow between your applications, and your people, when they move from one another, they can understand that. The bad part is, of course, vendor lock-in. That's something we started to speak before actual presentation started, because Next.js is developed in a bit of that word for one particular company. So it could be hard to then eject like Next.js from your React application, right? Because you have all of this next dynamic, next image, next something, which became like, you have the React lazy now, right, or something, but you already have a next dynamic, which does exactly the same thing, but with loadable. It was loadable before they wrote it, but you know, that's appropriate development. It's kind of good for some time, but sometimes you get tired of that. So, getting back to this slide, all of these tools all together, right, are designed, if they're used together properly, they pretty much can resolve the issues which we spoke and give you some benefits which everybody hyped around, right? So you can split, you can micro frontends, you can do the stuff, like, sounds great, but you heard this many times. But then you came back from from a conference to your team and like, I have a great idea. We're gonna split this out, right? And we're gonna do like model federation micro frontends, everything in X. And then you have your like very senior architecture people or whatever. This is very old joke, right? But it works, so don't touch, it's enterprise. We should not do like maintenance whatsoever. Yeah, unfortunately. But like what we want, start with the good part. Like we want to work with a modern tech stack, right? Because our brain should work. To make our brain work, we should feed it with new stuff, new information. We are not kind of robots to repeat the same stuff all over again, right? We want to have a quick builds because waiting is skill. That's why like they ask me to wait. I cannot wait. Like I don't have ADHD, or maybe I do have, I don't know. But I hate to wait. It's just killing me slowly because if I have like a project which builds more than 3 or 4 minutes, I have 2 or 3 projects in parallel do something. I cannot wait. It's kind of killing me, right? We want less politics. We want to do stuff, like to bring interesting features, to bring new fixes, to try something, learn something. Like, we don't want to work with legacy code, right? We have another Zach, he does commits, that's how I call his commits. And we want to make interesting tasks, something which makes us exciting. And then we have a business. Like, business has two main features that they want, like earn more money, less money, right? But taking that seriously, like Zachary on review, like, why you have two same slides? I'm like, yes, they say same two slides, but in different words. What business do wants, or kind of, they doesn't know that they want that, but right? They call it time to market, like quick feature delivery or quick fix delivery, right? Because those two parts, when we are roasted for not being productive, but when your build is 3 hours long, how could you be productive? You have to wait 3 hours while it builds. Like, yes, I fixed it. It's building. Next building, most likely. So, there are downtime, because downtime is money. Who was in downtime, which costs a lot of, I would say, like, people who know how shit ton of money can cost downtime, always trying to make some kind of quick rollbacks or something like that, because they don't deploy once, they deploy 2 servers and then switch. They don't deploy on the same server again. It's like a bad habit. And something which business doesn't know, but they actually want that, because it's, again, helps them to earn more money, is a spin database. But before we dive. Both, actually. Hopefully I will be able to finish this talk before we die. I'm sorry. Model federation is not Webpack exclusive, right? There are not only native federations, there are like other approaches, and there are like model federation friendly, I would say, approaches, and especially for Webpack, I suppose it's in development yet. But take a look on this one, which is Universe. So both two model federation kind of space and organization is under sometimes available Zachary Jackson review, somebody not. About the Universe part, because model federation is Webpack plugin, right? That's just a plugin. But then you want to use this with Next, with something else. You want to use this with SSR. It's not going to work from the box just as a plugin. You need additional, most likely, plugins or like NPM libraries to make it work seamlessly to, like, you know, do less and have more, right? That's something similar with us in business. Do less and earn more, right? And second one is model federation examples, which we covered mostly with end-to-end tests now, because we are developing those plugins and we should be aware if something goes wrong. I don't know, there are almost 100 of different combinations of libraries, frameworks, and versions of our plugins which are used, covered with end-to-end test. So if you have a question about like how this combination of framework library gonna work, which plugin from Model Federation Universe I need on top of like just Model Federation, like second repository, and that's something where you can find it, right? So, you know, there are always a person who like, everybody excited, and there was one like bad person who was like, but it seems it's not gonna work, right? That's usually me. So everybody just loves me about that. So how's like typical model federation trip looks like? You know, each time I hear an idea from enterprise, we're gonna try model federation. I'm like, yes, love that part. Let's start it. So first step, usually, right? As I said, it's really to add model federation to your application. But then you, like what we speak about, like code organization, sharing standards, and all of that stuff, that's something which you have to keep in mind. You don't have to do this like as a step up front, but that's something you have to keep in mind. Like in a kind of architecture application. You heard that your application has an architecture, right? So you keep in mind there was an architecture. You have never seen that, but it should be there, right? So when you add model federation, you should understand how you're gonna add it. Or it will be shell application, or it just will be regular application, but configured as host container. Doesn't really matter. There are differences on what this kind of, one way or another, you will have a host container. The difference is how do you understand what this container gonna provide to your remote containers. You have to define, now we go to particular parts and entry point. The responsibility of entry point is to define which remote containers will be injected by URI, right? A list of URLs to inject, which is interesting. Then you have to define on a host container shared libraries. A list of shared libraries which are going to be shared in between host and a remote and between remotes. And as I said, it's very important for your performance. But you develop host and other team develops remotes. So you're going to know. Next funny thing is routing. Yeah, because we get used to, we can use routing from any part of our application. When you go micro frontends or model federation, that's not true anymore. When you define and share state of your application, you can try to use something like Redux or whatsoever. You have to make it as a shareable singleton library, but you will have a joy of name collisions, which is kind of separate.
I hope you are having a lovely time at the conference in person.
Then you have some kind of authentication. Now you don't share just the UI components anymore. You actually share independent functionality, which has a front end and a back end. So you combine micro front ends now, which are deployed on different names, URLs, and actually should be authenticated somehow, each of those. But only shell or like root container is actually mostly responsible for this authentication process. Or you could have a micro frontend who is responsible for all that stuff, which is then shared, could be. And usually, but a small part, usually your remote host container defines the layout of your application, which is again, could be layout, responsible like layout container, could be just another micro frontend, whatever. The fun part, which we get here, like we had a huge enterprise, right? We need to work with that part. And the easy part here to get is that we configured small model federation host, and now we can attach a container, which could be built completely independently, which saves us a lot of time and effort. So all of those benefits of micro frontends and model federation could be gained with a small kind of effort, right? Almost like that. So the caveats, which I told just a bit briefly on previous slide, that you have a hard-coded list of remote containers. Remote containers most likely going to have their production stage and development environments, which you're not going to be able to consume because they're hard-coded. So you will have to think about that, right? And those are defined or dynamically at runtime, but most likely not. That's Webpack config. So it's defined in your build time. And it's going to be fun, right? Because there are some things which has to be shared as libraries upfront. For example, styled components, if you will try to combine host and remote and you don't share style components, you don't get what you expect because there are two different compilations, and then you have HTML compiled with one styled components with some classes, and your CSS was provided with a different one. And for some different, for some reasons, they did not match. Cool beans. Hardcore and shares as devs via config, which is you have to actually hardcode that stuff. Knowing and defining all of the libraries which are used by your application, by your remote containers could be tricky because we speak about independence of our remote containers from a host, but then we say we here in another team have several libraries which we're gonna use, but we cannot use that because we have to go to the host team and say we are gonna use some additional libraries. Please add those to configuration because until you're gonna install that on a host, you're not gonna be able to use them here. So they have to rebuild monolith and deploy new shareable libraries, and then we can deploy our new remote container, which sometimes happen that we just deploy our remote container in 2 days. You have 2 days to enable those shared libraries. So that's kind of politics from a different perspective. And one of the things which could be tricky for a host container is enabling communication between remote containers. Yes, because you have remote containers which doesn't have a shared application state. They have different application, and sometimes they're actually dependent on each other or have to provide additional information in between each others. And your host container have to somehow enable them to communicate. And there are many ways to do that. All of them are painful. So no spoilers here, that's something you're gonna find out on your own. But even buses is my favorite way of paying to make this communication work. So routing caveats. Now, as I said, like you have like before that you have an application and you could use routing from any place of your application, right? Now remote containers should not do that because remote containers are attached somehow to a host, but they don't have an access to routing, and they should have a zero knowledge about their host, correct? That means they cannot do navigation. That means you have to develop contracts in between your remote containers and the host application in terms of how remote containers gonna request navigation to some another part. That's a contract of communication, right? We will remember this part, and this will be interesting. But this even painful part about the routing gives you very interesting thing. It gives you a granularity, which there are like important thing about model federation that you do expose this. You split somehow even those parts which you expose into independent parts, right? And here you have a granularity. If you know that your container cannot have more than one page, you know that you will export page by page. And then you will have a contract to the host that there will be a particular container responsible for routing inside of you. Then the host container gonna include you, will take a look on the routing which you provided, and will be able to manage the routing for your remote container. Error handling is a separate kind of interesting stuff. Again, if you have a monolith, everything under your control. Now you have another failure point. Your remote container could fail at loading time. That's not a big deal, but only if you're on React 18, for example, right? So the good part about that you have now suspense, you have boundaries. One failed container doesn't fail your application, which is a good and a bad at the same part. The good part about that whenever you work with remote stuff, and somebody broke their container, it does not break your application. On the tricky part, if you want to provide a user human-readable errors from a remote container, because remote container has its own API, it has its own user workflow, it has its own ways to fail, like in a predictable manner fail, right? And somehow has to communicate that back to host application, and host application should have unified way, like in terms of UX, unified way to show that error to human, so human knows what to do. And that's another point where your best solution here is to actually build a contract of communication between remote and host, right? Which sounds as a standard of communication of your containers, which is actually standard of communication in between your teams. And there will be one team which is responsible for host eventually, which will be a platform team defining the standards of developing your application, even if it's distributed, right? That's why technology agnostic, kinda, because you have your sandbox where you can play and deploy, but there will be shared standards, and to make those shared standards apply to most of your small micro frontends, you have an X, right? So you have an issue and you have a tool which is designed to resolve that issue. You have an issue with those huge teams and whatsoever, you have a model federation and huge deployments, huge builds, and you have two tools to resolve those issues, right? Which is model federation and an X, right? Moving forward. An issue which I don't know better sample to like resolve is assets, right? You pull remote container has a CSS or image tag with source, and there are like good and bad. If they use absolute URLs to where they are deployed, you are fine, because like image assets whatsoever, they're gonna work. If they use relative passes, 2 minutes, great. If you have relative passes, you are doomed, because now you have to work with code. You have no idea what it's gonna be. Like, you have an URL, you're gonna inject that, and you're gonna suffer from that point, because you need to know how to actually, like, random code appears on your page and it should work properly, right? So there are several approaches. One is that you are able to actually provide a base URL from host to remotes. When you attach that, it's just a component, so you can provide there some configuration. And again, you build a contract on how should be displayed or used assets, which is good. Secondly, if like it's completely unpredictable, uncontrolled remote container, you always what you can do is to actually attach additional HTML, and you're able to decorate that HTML with some on errors handling, which then tries to, it knows, you know what container you wrap, you know where you get it, and you can wrap it in order to try again and to like change the URL to a proper one. So deployments, that's why I said like versioning will be critical here, because like remote entity.js without hashes and name, that's something you will have an exclusion to your caching. But if you version, you have like 2-3 main benefits. First, you have quick rollbacks to previous version of your container. Remote or host, doesn't really matter. Like it's instant. You'll deploy something new one, it breaks, you see it on Sentry, you roll back the version, which container you use, and it works again, right? You have a time to fix that. But on the other hand, now you have not only one CI/CD and deployment environments to manage, you have multiple environments. Now knowing the price, and we have 1 minute, that would be interesting part. Model federation is really easy to start. Hold him, like maybe you will win me a minute. Easy to start is kind of configuration you will bring to your application. You can upgrade dependencies because you don't have one huge parts where you have like dependencies update means your code update, right? So if you have a small scope of your code and you do upgrade dependencies, it's much easier and faster to do your code upgrade. And most likely Unix gonna have some kind of AST migration which will gonna upgrade it for you, right? Which is great. Blah, 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 blah. So defining standards is superpower, and this is what you need for Next.js, for example. Whatever you generate, and the first line is how you can generate next application with Unix, just one-liner. And pretty much this one will be 5 or 6 additional lines to your Next.js configuration, and this is your host application. That's when I say like it's easy to start with model federation in your application. Secondly, that's my favorite one. Give me 2 minutes, please. And this one is when you're like model federation, there are common confusion that model federation not going to fix your teamwork, like politics, right? Because politics is enterprise is a huge deal. But it's going to fix your teams. Because when I was saying, you will have to develop the contracts of communication between applications. We as humans cannot like split our responsibilities and who is responsible for what. But when we say like, okay, we have an applications and those applications will be responsible for different domains, and now we will set up a standards and contracts how those applications are going to work together, how they will evolve, deployed, and consume each other. That's, we are, as engineers, we know how to do that, right? So our internal politics doesn't really matter up here at this moment because we put this issue in between team communications on a different like level of engineering level, and on that engineering level we are able to perform and we know how to establish that. So yes, it's kind of, you're gonna hate each other like even then, but this approach is gonna work and make you like things you know, work faster, and you're gonna fix it. So I skipped the next slide, you have heard that, but I suppose I have highlighted most important parts. He's taking time. Skip Next.js here because it's framework for you. It's not you for a framework, it's framework for you. So we spoke about Next.js, about its core organization, that it has a lot of tools, it has ecosystem built for it, and you have a shared libraries, and it has a standards, and it's predictable, right? So that's what framework has to give to you, right? And this is great because when you choose a set of tools for your path to easily move in from your monolith to micro frontends, model federation, with Nix, NX, Next, whatever. You choose the framework, and you have from the tool belt you choose 90% of the things you're gonna need. There are one small piece which you eventually will find out that you somehow need to understand what's happening up there. Because if you have control only on like some container hosting remote, it's a moment you will gonna lose which versions they use, where they deployed, what other versions do they have. So, and this is kind of one of the tools. That's kind of, it's emerging market, right? So that's one of the tools which is gonna help you.